We're going to get things started. Thank you all for coming this afternoon, joining us here at the New America Foundation. For those who don't know, New America Foundation is a policy institute here in Washington, D.C. We do a lot of work.
Video on there. Video either.
We do a lot of work on various issues here in D.C., everything from healthcare reform to telecommunications. And we here today are joined by an illustrious panel who's going to talk about some of the more recent work that we've done on the future of community media. And community media is sort of a topic that's close to our heart. I run the Open Technology Initiative here at New America, and it turns out that a lot of both myself and my staff have come out of the community media realm. So I can remember, for example, back in 2000, applying for a low-power FM radio license. It took us 5 years to get through that process, but in 2005, WRFU, Radio Free Urbana, 104.5 LPFM, was founded. And so I'm really excited to hear sort of what's next for low-power FM, especially given the signing in January by President Obama of the Community Radio Act, which will greatly enhance and expand the number of low-power FM radio stations here in the country. We also have been involved in everything from members of my staff sitting on cable commissions to founding community technology centers and community media centers to even founding a newspaper, The Public Eye, in Urbana-Champaign, Illinois. So for us, I mean, we're sort of now dressed in suits and talking about the policy, but we actually have a long history of being practitioners of community media. And I think that expertise really shines in the work that we'll be talking about today. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention at least that this work has been the culmination of input from a huge number of different people. I mean, we really were able to tap expertise throughout the Alliance for Community Media Network, both the leadership there and the membership, as well as other folks all across the country, from municipal representative, key decision makers here inside the Beltway, to folks that are just working in their own communities to make a go of some really innovative solutions for the future of community media. And a lot of that is reflected in sort of this forward-thinking piece about what that future may look like. So my voice is going, and I'm going to turn it over to Tom to sort of go through some of the logistics, introduce folks, and get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. Sasha said, my name is Tom Glazier, and I'd like to welcome you here to this event. I lead our work here on media policy as part of a team housed within Sasha's Open Technology Initiative. And we've really been looking at how the changing media writ large and the technological landscape affects citizens' participation in a democracy. As the Knight Report on Sustaining Democracy in a Digital Age, the report we use as the starting point for our media policy work, argues, individuals need three things to participate in a democratic society: relevant and credible information, the education needed to engage with that information, and opportunities to participate in the public life of their community. The access to and use of infrastructure that underpins that engagement is critical. Now, part of that is public access television, and it's been a national movement for decades. For those of you who were in the room before the event started would have seen the tremendous maps that Rob McCausland, sitting in the middle at the back there, has been compiling over the last few months. He's identified over 2,000 PEG channels. And with that movement in the background, with the Knight Report, we received an invitation from the Alliance for Community Media, the organization that represents the community access channels. And we've, as a team, as Sasha mentioned, have written the report you picked up. And we've invited, alongside the key author, 3 other excellent panelists, and we'll precede that with some comments from Steve Waldman, who is leading the Future of Media inquiry at the FCC currently. So I'll welcome Steve in a moment and just mention that we'll also be having Josh Breitbart, who's a member of the Open Technology team, a long-term community media activist and senior field analyst at New America, Sylvia Strobel, Executive Director of the Alliance for Community Media, Brandy Doyle, the Policy Director for the Prometheus Radio Project, which is an organisation that's been very active as part of the move to pass the Local Community Radio Act, and also, and that's where you hear the buzzing in the background and the screen down behind us, Laurie Cirivello of Grand Rapids Community Media Centre, who will be joining us via Skype. Before I invite Steve, I must mention that this event is being live streamed on the web, and as I often say, it is on the record forever, at least as long as Google or WikiLeaks can find it. For those of you on Twitter, please use the hashtag #NAFevent. We have a member of our team in the audience who will be piping up with questions taken from Twitter. And so with that said, I'd like to invite Steve to the stage to provide some introductory comments, and perhaps if you could just share from 1 to 100 your detailed recommendations in the report.
Thank you, Tom. I'm actually going to sit down and use this as my my podium. The FCC in December of last year launched a project on the future of media and information needs of communities, looking at a very broad range of issues, including local media in the traditional sense, but as well as community media and non-media institutions that help provide civically important information. So since we haven't come out yet, I'm afraid I can't share the recommendations yet. But I can give you, I would like to give you a few broad strokes about what we're seeing, mostly which came from you, which is it reflects the assessments that the community world, media world, gave to us. First, most obvious is that community media is more important than ever. I hope that is a obvious statement, but in case it isn't, it's worth just remembering what has happened to the media landscape in the last 5 years. And just these statistics will probably be familiar to you, but just as an example, from 2006 to 2009, editorial spending at the nation's newspapers declined by 1/3. Newspaper staffs dropped by about 1/4. In some places, staffs were cut by half. In total, the staffs of newspapers are down to pre-Watergate levels now. Television network news staffs have dropped by half since the 1980s. News magazine reporting staffs, where I used to work, have dropped by half since 1985. Only about 28 cities now have all-news radio stations. So the institutions and local communities that had been providing important elements of information, news, journalism, accountability journalism, are contracting, and it remains to be seen whether or not the internet by itself is going to fill that. So far it hasn't. But all of this is kind of a context for community media. Now, the other thing we heard from community media leaders over and over again is that community media needs to change, needs to adapt, and everyone had different views about what that meant. There was lots of agreement that change was good, but of course not necessarily uniform agreement about what change meant. But I think a common thread that we heard was simply the idea that initially, in the early days, community media, a very strong rationale for community media was providing access to people who didn't have voices. And that has partly changed. The internet has given more access to people who don't have voices. Now, you can overstate that. There's lots of people who aren't on the internet for whom being on low power FM or PEG is a way of having a platform. But it is the case that some of the original rationale for community media has changed. And as a result, community media has already been adapting to this. We've seen it with community media centers that have taken on the challenge of encouraging digital literacy. So not just putting content on air, but actually training citizens on how to use the internet, as well as how to use the PEG channel. That's a hugely important function, I think, that may come into play. We are also seeing, it was always there, but maybe we're just noticing it more now, or it may be that people are really focused on it because people in community media are looking at the same changes on a local level that we are. Community media, not just providing platforms for opinions, but providing vehicles for journalism and the gathering of civically important information. So you have, just as some examples, Mount Prospect Television in Illinois provided disaster coverage when a hurricane went through town in 2007. The Chicago Access Network offers coverage of town hall meetings, community events, and works with healthcare organizations to disseminate education about AIDS. And increasingly you're seeing some examples where it is actual partnerships with journalistic entities. So I'm interested to hear the guest from Grand Rapids, because one of the examples we were told about was the Rapidian, a citizen journalism project that was formed by the Grand Rapids Community Media Center. We're seeing it over and over again in different cities. St. Paul Neighborhood Network partners with independent newspapers to produce public affairs content. They've also partnered with an independent African-American newspaper to produce 20 hours of public affairs programming. The Boston Neighborhood Network produces a nightly network neighborhood news show. So you can start to see that the image that maybe people have of PEG channels or community media as just a place for opinions and entertainment is evolving already. I'm sure it was always more diverse than that, but you can see that even when you're looking at the question of the gaps in civically important information, that community media is already can and must play a really important role. Same thing with low power FM. With low power FM, we heard about the example in Spokane where law students pair with local attorneys to provide radio law, a show called Radio Law, a program that informs listeners on legal issues of local interest. Station in Eureka, California runs a teen platform on air that provides training for high school students. So low power FM, and hopefully this will just accelerate with the passage of the Community Radio Act, is again looking at ways that it can respond to the new challenges of the modern 21st century media landscape, which has great benefits to it, but also gaps. And it's very exciting to see that community media has already evolved to that. We also heard very loud and clear from the community at large that we need a broader definition of what community media is. So certainly PEG channels, certainly low power FM, but increasingly hyperlocal blogs, phone apps, anything that maybe is very ground up form of community media. I would add an encouragement that the more that community media can appeal and engage red, blue, and purple America and be viewed as a kind of an asset and a tool of all Americans throughout communities, the more significant that community media will become, which is a good thing, because given what has happened in the nation's communities right now, it really is quite crucial that community media step forward and step up. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And with those words, community media is more important than ever, Steve Waldman, February 9th. Well, invite the four guests to the stage, and if Josh could join me here, Laurie just here, and Sylvia there, and then Laurie there. Oh, sorry, Laurie's there, but Brandy here. Sorry, Brandy there, Sylvia there. Sorry, and Laurie in the middle of the screen. Laurie, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you. So, Josh, you, among the team, were the principal author of the paper. You've pushed this paper into shape and really worked long and hard over it for many months. Can you share some thoughts on the analysis that it contains and perhaps some key recommendations?
Yeah, and as Sasha said, it was really a team effort, and not just OTI, but across the networks of community media. And we had the opportunity to attend the ACM conference in Pittsburgh in July and talk to a number of people there as well. And we wanted to look at community media broadly, but through the lens of public access cable and PEG and its legacy in community media, and look at where it was now, as Steve said, really a time of transformation. And we looked at some of the core features that community media centers, public access centers in particular, have provided in terms of participation in content, what we now sometimes call user-generated content or hyperlocal media, providing training, providing a community space, a space where you could participate in media and experience media not just as an individual thing, but as a part of a community. And then also having that access to the distribution infrastructure. And that was a profound accomplishment that really defined PEG in terms of having those channels and having that be a standard part, for many communities, having that access to this distribution infrastructure that went under public streets and using public rights of way. And we saw that there'd really been tremendous, as Steve was saying, success in those first three areas. And we could have written a much longer paper just going into all the successes and victories that community media has had in terms of how participation in content has become normal, if not equitable. And that even commercial media now recognizes there needs to be afforded a space for participation, and it's easy to forget that it wasn't that long ago that that was deemed absurd, and now it's commonplace. And we're seeing now, and certainly over the next decade, more and more community institutions taking on the role of training in media, and that's now seen as really an essential life skill, not just something you do in addition, but to be employed or to engage civically on any issue or in all sorts of walks of life, that having those media skills are now seen as necessary. And in the same way, community centers are more and more adopting media and technology as a core function. So those missions and those accomplishments and that vision really has permeated society and will continue to do so in the coming years. There still remains a tremendous amount of work to be done, and ACM and the panelists here are really leading that work. And it's, again, just a great opportunity to collaborate with them and learn from them in this process. But we identified that really the major threat and the one place where things seem to be moving in the wrong direction was in terms of the public's access to distribution infrastructure. And the clearest example is PEG, and the assault in the form of state franchising laws and other matters at the federal level, that there's been losses in that area, and we wanted to look at that and focus on how we could strengthen community media going forward by addressing that challenge. How am I doing on time?
You've got plenty of time.
Okay. And the first thing we saw was that threat necessitates a multi-platform approach to community media. And what that looks like is that more and more community media centers that had been operating in one particular medium were increasingly taking advantage of new technologies or other opportunities to work across media. And that means cable and radio, as well as the internet, both wireline and wireless, and also mobile technologies. And I'm really pleased to have Lori on this panel because the Grand Rapids Community Media Center embodies that multi-platform approach. and that what that does is provide multiple opportunities so that if there are challenges or losses in one platform, there are other opportunities for distribution. Unfortunately, there are challenges and threats to really the public's access to all of those platforms and all of those forms of infrastructure. And we really saw that ACM had a real opportunity to provide leadership in this particular area of community media. So we looked at some key policy reforms that we thought would really create new opportunities or address some of the challenges in the community's access to distribution infrastructure. And I just want to go through a few of them here, and they're discussed in greater depth in the paper, and we can get, you'll also hear from panelists who really specialize in these areas. Of course, in the policy realm, it's a constantly shifting terrain. And one of the things that did shift in the course of doing this paper was the Local Community Radio Act went from dream to reality. And we discussed that, and we actually feel that ACM members are in many ways the constituency best positioned to take advantage of this opportunity. And we think that that's something that we'll discuss more in this panel, and really a great example of how having multiple platforms can be a strength. We looked at USF reform, the Universal Service Fund, which is now coming to the fore as an issue, and is a real opportunity in terms of access to funding and even the principle of universal access. And we are considering what lessons can we learn from the example of BTOP as we extend universal service from telephone to the internet, and understanding that that requires not just building infrastructure, but also providing people with access to the equipment and the training and education of how to use that. Although one of the things we note from BTOP, while it has brought a number of new organizations and types of organizations into the space of working with media and technology, that actually community media organizations are only involved in a very few projects, including the ones that OTI is supporting in Philadelphia and Detroit. Access Humboldt is a part of Zero Divides project in California, and there are other examples. But really, we think that community media has a great role to play in terms of helping people move forward with training and how to take full advantage of the internet. But there's also the need to ensure that we have an open internet, and obviously that is also something that there were changes as in the course of working on this, and we see that in particular with wireless internet, which is and the recent report from Pew that we see real divides in terms of race and ethnicity and how people are using different technologies. We need to make sure that that doesn't translate into some people having access and some people not. And we need to ensure that people can attach the devices that they want to wireless connections and be able to share and build on their connections. And then lastly, I'll just say that we also talked about assaults on municipal broadband. And public access is also, and the cable infrastructure and the achievements in terms of institutional networks, or INETs, is really setting a great bar, a great example for municipal infrastructure. And we need to really build on that when we talk about examples like Lafayette, Louisiana, where they've succeeded in building that community-owned infrastructure, even in the face of lawsuits and resistance from some of the incumbents. And we think that certainly there need to advance policies that make that more possible and remove barriers to that effort. Now this does open up a challenge. We talked about this quite a bit in terms of all these new areas of engagement, and a lot of additional resources are needed to take on all these other policy areas. And we go into that a little bit of how to build civic engagement in these policy areas in the paper, and perhaps we'll get a chance to talk about that in questions and answers if that's something people are interested in following on.
Great. Thanks, Josh. That's great. Sylvia, your organization the Alliance for Community Media, a stalwart member of the community media space. You asked us to engage in writing this report. You've read it, and there's plenty of analysis of the context in which ACM finds itself and the future it's facing. Can you share a few thoughts on about perhaps the paper or your analysis of ACM and its opportunities in the future?
Sure, thank you. And first, I want to thank the New America Foundation for its work on this paper. I know it's been a lot of time and energy and a year coming, but we really see this as providing our members in the ACM with a blueprint for moving forward. So thank you very much. I just want to give a quick overview, just a brief historical overview of our membership a little bit. The Alliance for Community Media has been around for more than 30 years, and we serve as a resource to and national voice for the users, the employees, volunteers, and supporters of public, educational, and governmental access television. And just so everyone knows, there are a lot of different ways to refer to that. You may hear it referred to as PEG, cable access, community television, and for the purposes of this paper, and I think a more broad and inclusive definition, community media. Community media has historically provided television production equipment, training, and airtime on a local cable channel. It's for the community members, nonprofits, governments, and other organizations. They go in and use that equipment, use that space, use that real estate, and produce their own programming to share locally. In 1976, George Stoney was a founder of the National Federation of Local Cable Programmers, today known as the Alliance for Community Media. Although some local franchising provided PEG access, it was not until the 1984 Cable Act that local or state franchising authorities could require for-profit cable operators to provide benefits to the local communities in which they strung their cables. These benefits took the shape as media access centers in which communities have access to a vital and local media communications resource. The goal of public access was and is to allow individuals and organizations to have a voice in their own community, to be active participants. Because of the work, training, and widespread use of access centers, participatory media is a success in many communities. ACM members pioneered the cultural shift to widespread participation in media production, which is now the norm in our society, as witnessed by a wide array of individually produced content on social media sites, websites, and the like. It is important to note, however, that the work of public access centers is far from done. ACM members provide a wide array of necessary services for local communities that extend well beyond the basic premise of participatory media. It is essential that community media centers maintain existing services and funding while re-envisioning and realigning their mission, goals, and objectives to meet 21st century needs. This policy paper that was prepared by the NAF provides a roadmap for the ACM and its members in doing just that. A quote from the paper, in case you haven't had a chance to read it in detail yet. For community media to survive, ACM and its peers need to push back, not just to preserve cable channels and control over local public rights of way, but to open the internet, lift restrictions on mobile telephony, and reclaim the public airwaves. The question is, how do we do this? The ACM must be included at the table and set the agenda at the federal level rather than constantly reacting to the recommendations of others. The ACM and its members also need to embrace change, or more precisely, evolution of the media landscape and supporting technologies that will allow participatory media to thrive and evolve in ways not envisioned in 1976, or for that matter 5 years ago. Currently, many community media centers rely on franchise fees from cable companies to cover their equipment and operating costs. These franchise fees can be required by franchising authorities under the Communication Act, but many communities have seen their portion of the fees reduced due to a number of factors, including state laws that usurp local government's ability to negotiate for such fees. Additionally, some new entrants in the content distribution market, such as cellular telephone companies, do not currently pay franchise fees or have obligations to support local community programming, thereby undercutting new sources of revenue at a time when existing sources of revenue are on the decline. Unlike public broadcasting, PEG channels do not receive federal or state funding. They don't have an authorization line. Community media has historically received funding through franchise agreements, and without such funding, it will be difficult for our members and centers to re-envision their local role or sustain their positions as local anchor institutions. Community media must find new sources of revenue to sustain content production and support an expanded role in education and advocacy in its communities. The ACM and its members understand that all too well. However, community media could be cut off at the knees at a time when it is often the only source of critical local news, information, and educational programming, and during a period of incredible growth and opportunity for future expansion of local services through technology. In addition to the funding concerns, community media must simultaneously address the issue of access. Another quote from the paper: "Among the challenges with cable franchises is that cable providers use the cable infrastructure, same wires and same rights of way, to offer broadband and telephone services, but local authority and franchise fees are only associated with the cable service. This confounds logic and inhibits PEG's ability to provide its services across all platforms evenly. PEG channels need to be readily available on cellular communications networks, the internet, and any platform delivering local commercial and non-commercial broadcast programming, all with the same quality, accessibility, and functionality, and not in lieu of cable availability. PEG channels should also receive consideration for such services from telephone and wireless companies, and advocate for a fee on any infrastructure utilizing the public rights-of-way so that services are not diminished, and the individuals who are unserved and underserved are not penalized with additional costs. The ACM is promoting collaboration by its members and within their respective communities to build upon core competencies and share resources. However, community media cannot do it alone. Cable, telephone, wireless, and the broadcast industry must also be accountable to the communities in which they operate. Open access on cellular networks is key to preserving the free flow of information, including community media, through the airwaves. Additionally, commercial broadcast licensees need to be held to standards that protect localism, diversity, and public interest. Community media centers could and should serve as a key resource for both commercial and public broadcasting, as a partner in developing local news, in disseminating local emergency information, and in training community members on new technologies needed for workforce development. This public policy paper provides a blueprint for the future of community media, with the understanding that much change is needed. Local, state, and federal regulations need to be updated to reflect 21st century technologies. Sufficient funding of community anchor institutions is needed to ascertain that the average citizen continues to have access to relevant and objective local information. The underserved and underserved, particularly those without means of access to the internet, receive critical training and information, and all have a meaningful voice in their local communities. New business models, partnerships, and extensions into education, workforce development, and public safety may all result in new and indispensable services from community media centers. The seminal 1992 Aspen Institute report of the National Leadership Conference on Media Literacy notes that a media literate person, and everyone should have the opportunity to be one, can decode, evaluate, analyze, and produce both print and electronic media. Not only is it still important today, it is even more important. Digital literacy should be a required part of the educational curriculum in schools, and community media organizations, while often overlooked, may be the best source for such training. We must provide not only digital literacy training to our citizens, but also extend and add distribution platforms to allow for the broadest reach of and access to local programming and information. This includes broadening the definition of community media infrastructure to include not only cable channels, but physical facilities, educational offerings, distribution and institutional networks, utilizing low-power FM licenses, developing web-based training modules, and rethinking how content is developed for simultaneous use on air, online, and mobile is a must. In conclusion, ACM and its members realize that the time for self-assessment is now, and that the need to protect local voices has never been greater. Change is not optional, it is required, and to do otherwise is the equivalent of writing our own obituary. We look forward to leading a thorough self-assessment of community media and redefining our agenda to include multiple platforms, partners, and participants. We value the work of the NAF and the recommendations in this paper and will waste no time in taking steps to leverage community media assets and grow the opportunities for participatory media.
Thank you, Sylvia. That's great. You mentioned Prometheus, and we have sitting next to you Brandy Doyle, who's the policy director of Prometheus, who's emerged from the recent victory and a bill passed in Congress, which is no small achievement at the moment. Could you talk a little bit, perhaps introduce Prometheus? This is a predominantly PEG channel public access audience, and then perhaps talk about partnerships. We've heard about the possibilities of LPFM licenses. Could you share a little bit of about that? And then perhaps some ideas on access to spectrum, because I know that that's been a key motivating factor for Prometheus.
Sure, thank you. So the Prometheus Radio Project helped to establish the low-power FM radio service more than 10 years ago. And when it was limited by Congress, soon after it was established, thanks to the commercial broadcast lobby, we fought for the last 10 years to expand low-power FM, LPFM radio. And thanks to the organizing efforts of grassroots groups nationwide and diversity of public interest groups here in DC, we won. And it's very exciting. The president signed the Local Community Radio Act into law on January 4th, returning authority to the FCC to license low-power FM stations in urban areas. So depending on how the FCC implements the law, we expect to see hundreds to thousands of new low-power FM stations, hopefully in the largest markets in urban areas that have never yet had their opportunity for low-power community radio. We see this as an opportunity not just to expand radio, but to build community media infrastructure. And for that reason, we're very excited to explore partnerships with PEG stations, to build community wireless networks around LPFM stations where they're needed, and to explore the model of community media centers with the stations that are ready to grow. Now, I know that many PEG stations around the country are under threat, and so it may seem strange for me to talk about how, from our perspective, PEG is well positioned to take advantage of this opportunity, and in fact better positioned than many of the other groups that have contacted us. We've gotten actually a number of requests from PEG stations around the country about this, and from our perspective, they're extremely well positioned to grow in this direction. For those stations that aren't under those kinds of threats, they have substantial resources for community media infrastructure. Aligning with the comments in the paper, there's a discussion of community media infrastructure there beyond physical infrastructure, but sort of the broader networks of infrastructure, institutional networks, communities, fiber optic cables. I mean, there's all these different levels of infrastructure that community media has. And PEG stations have a number of these ready to go. They have training capacity. They have the ability to manage volunteers. They have community engagement and relationships to local organizations, and some less tangible resources like comfort with technology and the ability to share that technical knowledge with others, a commitment to public access. And these less tangible resources are the foundations of community media centers, and they don't depend on a particular platform. Last spring, I visited Davis Media Access, which is an organization in Davis, California, that has both PEG facilities and a low-power FM station. And we talked a little bit about the synergy in their organization between the two. And they found when they started the LPFM that the radio station brings in more volunteers off the street who are more, it's a little bit simpler to train volunteers on the radio, and then those volunteers tend to transfer over and join in participating in video production as well. It's easier for them to do remote live broadcasting with the low-power station, so they end up doing a lot of local events, going down to the farmers market, doing live broadcasting from different community events, bringing them access to relationships and partnerships with the city government and with local nonprofits that strengthen both stations. And they find that, although their franchise fees for the PEG station can't go to the LPFM actually brings in the majority of donations from individual donors, because people are more familiar with the model of donating to a pledge drive for a radio station. So they found that it's really strengthened the total organization and raised their profile in the community to do both. And we think that for a lot of stations like Davis, that there's a real opportunity to use both platforms together to build a community media center. As Tom mentioned, another key aspect of community media infrastructure for Prometheus is community access to spectrum. And as you know, spectrum is publicly owned. The publicly owned airwaves, they're used by broadcast and television and radio, and as well as newer uses such as community wireless networks, Wi-Fi, and then a lot of new applications for these old systems. So there's a lot of opportunities for new applications for mobile technology, for community media. And as a principle, we see community access to spectrum as a platform-agnostic way to evaluate new technologies and policies. For many of the communities that we work with, low-power FM is the easiest way for them to access spectrum in terms of the cost, the simplicity of the technology, but not for all. So, for example, we work with some stations for whom the most appropriate technology is streaming over the internet. For other stations, that's not affordable due to the costs associated with the bandwidth and the servers and the fees. So, but what it comes down to for us is that these decisions should be made when evaluating kind of as technology changes and policies change, the decisions should be made on the basis of community need and community circumstances. I want to note that open infrastructure, technology, and policy have to be linked to ensure good outcomes for communities. One example of a new technology that seems to bring our media system into the future, but actually is the wrong direction, in our view, is the way that digital radio has been rolled out in the US. So here's a technology that allows more efficient use of spectrum that hypothetically could expand community access to the airwaves, but the particular policies in the way that it's been rolled out doesn't actually do that. It relies on proprietary software. The equipment is available from a single company, which charges exorbitant fees. And instead of making that new spectrum available to those who've never had access to the airwaves, it's only available to incumbent licensees, those few companies and organizations that already have access to radio. So that's an example of how we shouldn't be uncritically utopian about the possibilities in each new technology, but rather evaluate it on the basis of whether it's expanding community access to media. And I guess I'll end on noting that we see the paper ends on the discussion of participatory infrastructure, and we see participation as fundamental to community media, and it's what distinguishes community media, I think, from other types of public media. As media production and distribution becomes simpler and more people can create and upload YouTube videos, it's worth noting that participation goes beyond participation in content production. It's participation in technical innovation, as with open source software and community wireless. It's participation in shaping our media policies, and it's participation in governance of these media outlets, in this case, community media centers. That's what characterizes a community media center over individually based media production, citizen journalism, or other forms of public media. So one great example that I know about this is WGXC Hands-On Radio in the Hudson Valley in New York. Long before they got on the air, they formed a radio council, which is made up of leaders from different communities represented in their listening range, representatives from the arts, from the agricultural community, from seniors. There's a strong Bangladeshi community in that area. And these leaders, they're not programmers on the station. They're not a community advisory board that meets a few times a year to give input on the programming. They're actually the governing body of their station, and they're setting policies on the mission, governance, and the programming on the air. So in this sense, community itself is part of the media infrastructure that we're discussing today, and probably the most important resource in ensuring the future of community media. So I also want to thank OTI for the bold vision here, and I look forward to realizing it together.
Thanks, Brandy. Now, Laurie, you're still with us? You can hear us?
I think I'm still with you.
You are. Thank you for sticking with it.
Sure.
You are at the sharp end of the stick. You're actually running a community media center. You're not a policy person one step removed. you've seen the report, and you run a centre that was previously run by Dirk Koning, whose birthday, I believe, would have been tomorrow.
Yes.
For those who don't know, Dirk Koning was a leading light and a visionary in this field. So you're in Grand Rapids, and so how do these ideas look from Grand Rapids? And perhaps you could share, we've heard a little bit about the Rapidian, but I know that you have a theatre as part of your community media centre. You really run the gamut. Please describe both the centre and your responses to the report.
Sure. I'm really glad to be able to be there today, even though I'm not there today. I am not, as you have said, not a public policy expert, but I was asked to share a little bit about what constitutes a multi-platform CMC in our community, and a little bit about how it works. To our community, we are trying to be what's sort of known as an assistive organization that solves community problems. And the tools that we use are media and technology because they work. The policy paper in many ways really does echo both our belief system and our firsthand experience. I really do appreciate and applaud the work of the New America Foundation on the project, and also the Alliance for Community Media for requesting the study. This is really important. And you're also going to find that I'm going to echo some of the comments that have already been made today. So a little bit about us. We currently have 2 access channels, a public channel and an educational access channel. We have a 10,000 watt community radio station, so that is full power. We have the Rapidian, which is a relatively new citizen journalism, community-driven local news, hyper-local news platform. We do IT services for nonprofit organizations. We have media and technology training services. We do have a historic performance and film venue that is outfitted with two-way technology. And we also have a new media project development team or teams. The report says mission is constant, but the terrain has changed. In our minds, the terrain's always changing. And we try to constantly be collecting, developing, and distributing new tools and frameworks to meet identified community needs or to leverage opportunities that happen to come our way or our community's way. Our public access services, however, I have to say, are at the very core of what we do. Everything else has grown from that structure, and everything is built on the core values of public access. When I assess what we do and how we think as a multi-platform media center, I really can break it down to sort of 5 key considerations. First is, how do we look at our values? How do we establish them, and how do we stay true to them, and what are they? These are going to be really common. They're empowering diversity of voice, our commitment to our local community, a core belief that communication structures are really necessary pieces of community infrastructure, kind of like roads and sewers, and the importance of having an organization like a community media center that sets a neutral and inclusive table sort of around which the community can gather to find solutions. So that's really sort of that core value thing. And the second part that we feel strongly about is that it's our job and responsibility to continuously develop knowledge of trends and develop our expertise. So beyond knowing how to run a camera or a playback system, we expect ourselves to understand how people are communicating today. Who's controlling it? What new tools are available? Currently, we're working heavily in helping our nonprofit sector understand the role of mobile. For instance, we have a lot of service organizations that are trying to reach minority groups and folks in the inner city neighborhoods, and yet not understanding that statistically the largest adopters of mobile technology as their primary access tool to the internet are just exactly the populations they're trying to reach. In other words, folks who are using only mobile to access the internet, yet the service organizations, nonprofits, don't have websites that work on mobile. Things like that. Knowing that information and sharing that information. Other things we're working on, QR codes and tablet technology for use by our tourism and economic development folks. We work on those projects too. In other words, we're always looking at how can commercial developments be repurposed for community good. The third thing is really crafting our public identity. How does our community see us? Are we an access center, or are we really seen as a problem solver? This is in pursuit of something the report calls being an anchor institution in our community, which we feel is very vital. Meeting today, Red Cross came. A project is being developed to distribute 100 laptops. The city was called by Blue Cross, and they referred them to us to have us at the table to be part of this process. So it's really important that our identity says they are the go-to organization. The fourth is really maintaining access to opportunity. And again, this is really a process. We have to ensure, just as the ACM does on the federal level and we all do on the state level, we have to ensure that we are at the table. The way we do that here is by making sure we have diverse funders, a diverse group of people who have invested in different projects of ours, that we document our achievements, that we participate in community issue work. And by this I mean conversations around for the Coalition to End Homelessness, or other issues that, issues with our schools, things that aren't directly technology, but are the issues that are going to present the problems that hopefully we can help solve. And the Rapidian was a good example of that, of being involved with our community foundation on so many issues, made us an organization that they reached out to when the Knight Foundation proposed a matching grant program to community foundations. We were at the table and were therefore able to develop this program and this platform. The fifth is constantly examining our operational structure to make sure that we're promoting innovation. And I sort of talk about this in the way of, are we a restaurant with a fixed menu, or are we more like a well-stocked kitchen? I come from a foodie world, so the well-stocked kitchen really means that we have many, many things at our disposal so that we can custom create solutions, or in the case of a kitchen, dishes and recipes to meet specific needs. And an example of this is, how we look at content creation and distribution. I've been in this a while, and it used to be we sort of looked at it as come in, make a show, put it on the channel, and kind of rinse and repeat. And now we look at creation of meaningful content and helping people with that, and then figuring out the broadest distribution path for that, which includes access, but may include many other things as well. We're very big on cross-platform distribution and the repackaging of content to be used in many different places. I have to admit, and I hear this a lot, yes, in Grand Rapids we are fortunate. I do realize this. Our founder, Dirk, really pioneered the philosophy that in doing our work, we have to first understand the needs of those we're trying to serve, and then provide them with the right tools for the job. And in some cases that's a video camera, in some cases it's a megaphone, and as Dirk liked to tell, in some cases it's a bell. Further, we're very fortunate that our thought leaders here and our public officials continue to get it, that our access channels are the bearing wall of our organization, and that the investment that they make into PEG access through use of franchise fees allows us to continue to expand and develop new solutions. I really feel a profound obligation not to just say we have a contract to do access with this amount of money and that's what we do, but to actually take that foundation and leverage it and give them a better return on their investment. Currently, we are at 38% of our revenue comes for access-related services and is spent on access-related services. By that I mean traditional access. The other 62% represent those things that we've been able to build onto our access base. I can also say with confidence that if it weren't for this reputation in our community, we would be in a far more precarious position than we are. Still, however, without the affirmation and funding protection for community-controlled media at state and federal levels, our future, as well as everyone else's, is far from certain. We need state and federal commitments to concepts of open networks. We have to have stronger local rights-of-way protections. We're feeling that here. We need a greater understanding of the importance of media education, and not just theory, but hands-on. We need to have protections against counterproductive operating and funding agreements that really tie people's hands and keep us from providing the most effective service possible. Great example is when, yes, you can use money to buy cameras, but you can't pay for trainers. Putting tools in people's hands but not providing the wherewithal to make the most of them is hardly good service. This is a critical time, not just for access, but for our communities. But I also am of the school that believes it's a time of great opportunity. I do believe access centers are well positioned to be the ideal stewards of local communication innovation and infrastructure. We are local at a time when local is increasingly valued by the people next door and in our towns. We know how to put technology and tools in people's hands. We know how to be neutral, and that's a rare thing. We understand technology. We are in over 2,000 communities, and collectively we possess a vast array of knowledge and direct experience. We know how to empower other people rather than just control everything. But it's also true that within our sector, we need to do a better job of establishing our expertise, promoting innovation and partnerships, creating really unique solutions, and positioning ourselves as one of those critical anchor institutions.
Thank you, Laurie. That's fantastic, and really it's a testament to Dirk Koning's vision and your execution of that following his departure. Now, I'm going to turn to Jason and some questions from the audience very soon, and also from someone in the back there who I hope is monitoring Twitter. James, if you're great, he's monitoring Twitter. But first, I'll just ask one question, and I'll turn to you, Sylvia, first. The theme of this report is sort of, it's a multi-platform world. Partnerships are the future. And we've talked about LPFM, but are there other partnerships you have in mind that could be made? Maybe libraries?
Yes, absolutely. And some of this dates back to my prior work in public broadcasting, where I ran the State Public Television Network in Pennsylvania, which was a state government agency, and had the great opportunity to work with libraries and schools and emergency alert services, PEMA in the case of Pennsylvania, and a number of other institutions. And there was a great quote in the paper that really kind of jogged my memory. It said, "Libraries in particular have expanded their traditional role as repositories of knowledge to become centers for e-government access and workforce development. Like many public access centers, they have taken on these new roles while seeing their funding decline." That's absolutely right. We're all in a state of zero growth right now. But rather than trying to recreate the wheel and having us all compete for the same small pot of money, community media centers actually have the opportunity to partner with libraries and healthcare centers and VOTEC schools and workforce development centers and other community-based organizations to utilize all of our limited resources, skills, and knowledge assets. And I may be stepping out on a limb here, but I think it's also imperative that grant-making entities, foundations, government entities that give out grants actually make it a requirement that for a project to be funded, it must include a partnership with shared services. Because we all have limited resources, and it doesn't do us any good to just keep continuing the silo mentality. We need to be better utilizing the resources, skills, and assets we already have. I think working with libraries, workforce development centers, schools is critical. It will allow us to diversify our revenue, enhance our local service offerings, and continue to provide low or no-cost services to the citizens that need them most.
Thanks. And just before we go to the audience, Josh and Brandy, you're sort of very familiar with the sort of policy advocacy space. The policy changes that are required to underpin this vision are considerable. How do you think they can be built, and how quickly can this come about? And what do you think it's going to take? And however.
Sure. Well, part of what we do at Prometheus that I didn't discuss, in addition to doing policy advocacy in DC, we also work to build the stations and build communities around the stations to support them. So we've held 13 radio station barn raisings in the past where we've built...
Can you explain a barn raising?
Sure. So in a barn raising, we build a station over the course of a weekend with hundreds of volunteers from the local area and people who come in from all over the country who are community radio supporters, they're engineers, they're radio producers, they're sometimes volunteers from commercial stations and public radio stations, and people who want to start stations in their own area who want to see what it's like. So we bring together this big community of people. They build the studio, they put the antenna up, and they also do kind of DIY trainings on everything from station governance to media policy to managing volunteers. So in doing this, it's not the most efficient way to build a radio station, but we think it's the most efficient way to build a movement around community media and around media policy. And so we work to bring people together to make sure that these stations last and they can go back to their own communities and really understand in a hands-on way the way technology can be used in their own communities. So I think, in answering your question, I think that part of what needs to happen is, this continued focus on training that community media centers are good at, a continued sense of digital literacy as including literacy and policy, and connecting national policies to the hands-on work that's happening at these stations to really understand, issues like open internet protections, open internet rules are very complex and difficult to communicate to people in ways that they can understand. But if those policies are impacting the work that they're doing in their communities and what's possible with the mesh networks that they're trying to build, the things that they're trying to do at home, it becomes easier to engage people on national issues. And one thing I think that AMC members have that's a real strength that we don't tend to think of in terms of policy, and one recommendation in the paper is that ACM members think of themselves less as a community of media producers and more as community-controlled infrastructure. But as people who have a history, 30 years of thinking of themselves as media producers, there's a real strength in storytelling and people who know how to put together narrative and thinking artistically. And so I think that's a strength in terms of communicating these policy issues nationwide, that if we have artists and producers and content makers thinking about policy issues and communicating them, we can go farther.
Josh?
Yeah, and well, not shockingly, I totally agree with everything that you said. But I think that participating in media is one of its great strengths is that it begins with creativity and vision and bringing that to the realm of policy. And even how we build our infrastructure is so essential. And I think that's why emphasizing and building on participation in media is so crucial. Politics is the art of the possible. And we did want to walk that line of both being ambitious with the policy goals, but also recognizing what's possible. But in DC, it's very easy, or when you're dealing with federal policy, the horizon is day to day or week to week, and what's possible in that horizon is very limited. And so we also wanted to think about what's possible on a longer horizon. I think that's really what Brandy is getting at in terms of thinking about the cultural shifts that can happen when we get people to feel as comfortable creating policy and creating infrastructure as people now feel creating media. I think that's they're actually, I want to talk about that emerging technologies and new technologies that make that easier than ever to do. Talked about wireless networking and the advances made from a technological standpoint in mesh wireless using unlicensed spectrum are really profound, and I think now we have to catch up in terms of education and those cultural shifts so people understand that to use new technologies, they don't have to conform themselves or social relationships, but actually if you're talking about open spectrum and open technologies, that you can conform the technology to what you want. And as Lori said, not understand it's the purpose in its design, but understand the needs of your community and shape the technology and shape the media to meet those needs. And so I think that there are a number of ways that people can achieve the goals of community media in a long-term way without even relying on the week-to-week goals of policy reform.
Thanks, Josh. Now, Jason, you have the mic. I know we have people from out of town. Jim Haig represents the local community weeklies. Bryce from New York. Any questions from the audience? Oh, Bryce. There we go. Bryce, sorry.
You're not first. Yeah, I'm Bryce Wilson from Meridian Design Associates in New York. I was actually present at the founding of NIFLKIP with George. But my practice involves the design of the places where these technologies are utilized. And so this movement that you're talking about is of tremendous importance. I'm an urbanist, and so what Josh just touched on something very, very important. How can community media, including community access to information, enhance people's skillfulness as community members and their skillfulness to trust themselves as urbanists, to intervene in the shape of their communities and the shape of their infrastructure? That's a huge question. Another question is that, to me, the medium becoming multi-platform does an interesting thing with Marshall McLuhan's The Medium and the Message. Because at this point, the medium is almost irrelevant, even though it has to be everywhere. It's about the message. Again, to Laurie's point and to other people's point, that you got to look at where your community needs to communicate and make sure that your services are there. And it is really all about seeing the cable, the Community Media Center as an anchor institution and really going deeply into that meeting. The challenge, to me, and one of the reasons I came down from New York, is I'm wondering where the social entrepreneurs are, like Dirk and Laurie and other people who have just gone and done it. Look at what Laurie said. Only 38% of her revenues are coming from franchise fees because they're just out there doing it. So who else is trying to do it? BronxNet's trying to do it in the Bronx, but where are those people? I just want to let you know that I'm going to be presenting a part of a team presenting a paper in the American Planning Association in April about the integration of urban telecommunications infrastructure in the planning process. It's the first time it's ever been talked about there. Thank you.
Sylvia, where are the social entrepreneurs?
That's a really good question. That is actually, you've really nailed it right there. Where are the social entrepreneurs? I think, like most industries, our own members get comfortable in their own existence, in having a certain set of revenue coming in, a certain set of activities that they do. Everybody likes their comfort zone. And my motto and challenge to everyone is you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. You have to get out there and start looking at your business differently. You have to realize, and unfortunately it's probably going to take a kick in the behind, but the revenue that we've relied on, it's not just pegs, it's public broadcasting, it's libraries, it's everywhere. That revenue is gone, it's not coming back. So we've got to start thinking very differently. We have to be much, much, much more entrepreneurial. And the reality is some of our members will not make it. They just won't. But hopefully we have a really great paper here and some recommendations that will be a wake-up call to some of our other members to say, we need to change. You're not in this alone. You don't have to do it by yourself. There's a lot of information that can be shared. A lot of folks in your community and other organizations that are going through the exact same thing. And if anything, our community media centers should serve as the facilitators, should start bringing those groups in, not so much to talk about how do we get programming on the air, how do we work together to improve our communities and share our resources.
Laurie, do you have anything to add? Please.
I'm sorry?
Do you have anything to add? I thought you might.
Yes.
It sounds like go for it.
I would say that, where are the social entrepreneurs? We're kind of looking in the rearview mirror and saying something like, oh, that's what we're called. Social entrepreneurs. It wasn't that we sought that. We constantly just put our head down and say civic engagement and empowerment, all of those things are our core values. How do we do that? And we can't do it by ourselves. That being said, there are places, that this is happening. I think about San Jose. They don't have a big pot of operating funds. They're relatively new. They're creating this whole center with a different mindset. I know in St. Paul they're doing amazing things with training, and the list goes on. Sacramento, they're partnering with the commercial newspaper. I mean, these examples exist. Some motivated by a different kind of mind thought, and others motivated by the fact that they've said, wow, we can't count on these funds anymore. But within those 2,000 centers, I agree, some will not survive. But there are many others that are being entrepreneurial. It's just too little right now, and we need to learn more from each other on starting with the mindset, not just looking for that silver bullet.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add that I think we need to look, we often put the technology first and go to the sort of the vision and the civic engagement and the community building second. I think we need to reverse that, because actually the technology is the easy part. In our culture, sharing and collaboration is actually much more complicated. And so if you look where that's happening, and then you think about, well, how can we bring media and technology to support that effort? I think that's really the way that we're going to grow this field.
Absolutely.
James has a question from Twitter at the back there. Or James just has a question.
This comes from Rob Bowl at RBOLE. What is the percentage of PEG channels that exhibit the new evolution of being multi-platform innovative organizations? And perhaps to better define this question, I'll follow up with Rob's follow-up question. What are the best practices on multi-platform community media?
Best practices and what percentage?
I don't know the percentage. I would venture to guess that almost all community media centers not only have their cable channel, but they have a web presence of some sort. I think that's virtually a requirement for any business these days. But as to how they're using that web presence, how they're streaming content, whether they're streaming, whether they have mobile content available, I actually do not know the answer. We have a very diverse membership. Some of our members have annual budgets of $10,000 a year. Others go up into significantly greater numbers. It doesn't necessarily mean that the smaller members do less. It's very, very diverse. It's a good question, but I don't know the answer specifically.
And I think really Lori's, in terms of the second question, I think Lori's discussion of Grand Rapids exemplifies a lot of the best practices, namely letting the community's needs lead your efforts. And that's both in terms of how you approach the work, but also what is the appropriate technology or technologies and platforms to use.
And I think also, if there's a key mindset for what I think works, it's having a position, your organization, for servant leadership. I mean, really, we are a service organization that our job is not to convince people to use access tools or access channels or cameras. Our job is to solve problems related to prisoner reentry or prisoner recidivism. It's to solve problems of homelessness, to help solve problems of education and healthcare, all of those things that are core. And we are the experts on how the tools that we can bring together and the knowledge can help solve those problems. And when you're solving those problems, you become a very, very valuable and important piece of your community's work.
Great. Thank you, Laurie. Another question? The lady in the back, and then the gentleman in front. This lady there with the long hair. Greta.
Hi. Thanks so much for all of your work. I just had a question. I think one of you mentioned first responders, and it seems like the work that community media can do in situations like that makes it a lot more attractive to policymakers. So I'm wondering if you guys have any recommendations for utilizing that.
I can address it just briefly. I mean, there are kind of federal regulations that govern emergency response, but then each state tends to have its own individual plan, emergency communications plan, that has to follow the federal guidelines. And where access centers can really get involved is at the local and state level. because there are many participants in developing and amending and managing those state plans, monitoring what's working and what's not. There may be some major revisions coming soon to those state plans to take into account new technologies. And this is a great opportunity for community media centers to get involved, because they can definitely play a role in the hyper-local emergency management and emergency communication needs.
I can add to that. Low-power FM stations have also played a big role in emergency management, in particularly in Hurricane Katrina. There were a number of low-power FM stations that stayed on the air and were able to keep giving information locally in the storm and in the aftermath. And because the stations are so small, they can be run on a generator. In times when other cell phone towers are down and other radio stations and TV outlets are out, low-power FM stations can stay on the air. KDRT, which is the LPFM associated with Davis Media Access, is the official emergency partner of the city of Davis, and there are other stations that play that role for their cities as well. So they, and there's a number of great stories about stations that have been the only only outlet on during snowstorms and hurricanes. One last one, the station of the Immokalee farm workers, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Immokalee, Florida, played an important role in providing the only Spanish language information about the hurricane that came through there. And when the workers were kept out in the fields to the last minute so they could get the harvest before the storm hit, it was the station that really organized and brought transportation to get people out in advance of the hurricane.
Access Humboldt in Humboldt County, California, is it's a great example of that. And they looked at their county's emergency response plan and noted that in a disaster that destroyed roads and bridges, there would be, because of the mountains and rivers, 17 isolated islands of humanity in the county. And that the emergency response was premised on having each one of those isolated islands of humanity being self-sufficient in terms of food and emergency medical services. And Sean McLaughlin, talked to them about how you could use wireless communication to support keeping them in contact, but it required having the technical expertise to maintain that infrastructure in each one of those locations. And having local infrastructure is really critical to emergency response. But the other thing to keep in mind is that the first response invariably, and there's a Red Cross report on this, and invariably is actually from your neighbors. And so having community media and an engaged community, that is really the key, a key contributor that community media brings to emergency response.
And just to add, Sean McLaughlin is a fellow here, and Jessica Durkin, another fellow here, is also now a news director on emerging LPFM. So there's ways to get engaged, and we've been trying to bring those perspectives into this work here. There's the gentleman, Mr. Chen, here. There's a question from James afterwards. We'll take these two together, and if anyone else, and then we'll probably wrap it up.
Qiao Chen, Bethesda, Maryland. The community table in the community meeting is somewhat like a community meeting, where community meeting more efficiency than so-called community table, and with limited resources, both the money and the technology. Could or should the community medium with different function be consolidated, particularly in the big urban community? Thank you.
Thank you. And take this question from James as well. Please answer as you feel.
Well, Sean McLaughlin at Access Humboldt.
There he is.
And it ties into state policy. Beyond emergency response, what steps can be taken to engage with stateside policy, particularly public utilities and services commissions? I'd like to also add one more question from Jessica Clark at Beyond Broadcast. There's a burning question of where are the social entrepreneurs in community media?
Oh, that was me reporting, not me asking. Thanks, Jessica.
You'd like, could you?
So in terms of,
I want to address the state level because I've worked in state government and worked at that level. You know what was interesting, I think, for me was how disconnected everyone was in the emergency management field. There were so many different players, all that existed within their own silos, and we watched, unfortunately, time and time again, where emergencies came up and information was not getting out. And it was because of those silos. I think where state government is concerned and where community access centers can first really start making some inroads, work within their local community to start with, their local fire, police, hospitals, for instance. Gain a good, if they don't already have it, gain an understanding of what is needed within the local community first. Because often statewide or regional notices come out and they go and they're targeted to local communities. Secondly, and we've said this many times, get to know your elected state officials, get to know the state policymakers, the folks that run state agencies, participate in their open meetings, and many of them do have open meetings, and let them know who you are and what you do. Because, frankly, I don't think most folks at the state government level really understand what community media does, what it can do, or how it could fit within that bigger picture. And it's going to be an education process, and a lot of it's just picking up the phone, going to meetings, talking, and actually explaining what it is that you do, what community media does. I think once that conversation starts, a lot more opportunities are going to start rolling around for community media to get involved.
Okay. I mean, I would add in terms of on the Public Service Commission side, it is quite a challenge because every state is different, and so beyond the scope of this paper to really give thorough prescriptions for how each state should approach it. But one of the things we did point to is that work in this area is the weakest link in media reform because state utility commissions and state regulators have such a profound impact on our local experience of media, and yet we have so little activism and public interest infrastructure built around influencing those and monitoring those and working with those. It also is such an incredible opportunity because they don't just regulate the media, but also electricity services, heat, water, these really basic necessities. And when I was policy director of People's Production House in New York City, we followed the issue of our city's franchise with Verizon to the state level and saw how, falling down on the job those commissioners were, and were able to build a 45 organization coalition that included AARP and environmental justice organizations and housing rights advocates, and that coalition, which can be built around these commissions that regulate all these different areas, really has a potential to support and build out the support for community media. Also, unless somebody else wants to add to that, I can address.
Please take Mr. Jen's question.
So in terms of, does it make sense to consolidate the infrastructure in urban areas? I think it's a very interesting question. I think where we see the sort of the specific community media centers that are very multi-platform tend not to be, at least within ACM, in large urban areas. They seem to be more often in places like Grand Rapids or Brandon-Champaign. But if you look at a place like Philadelphia, where you have tremendous gains recently in community media, you have WPEB being given a new life as a radio station. You have PhillyCam, which was the result of a long struggle to get Comcast to honor the franchise agreement there. They're not the same organization, but what you see is organizations within Philadelphia making use of all those different things. And it's the community organizations that wind up tying it together. So they can work in concert without having to all be under one roof. And I think Philadelphia is a great example of that.
Yeah, and I just really quickly would love to add that, I think Grand Rapids is the second largest city in Michigan. I have to say that. Thank you. But I think the consolidation in the way of building collaborations to collect tools and knowledge is really important. But we find the most effective distribution is very decentralized because Building it, they will come, just doesn't work anymore for many reasons, and it's not the most efficient. And so we, try to find ourselves at many different tables that have a lot of different core, subjects going on. But we bring sort of the power of consolidated knowledge to bear at those many tables in those many places.
Great, thanks, Lloyd. And Brandy, any final points to make? No?
No, I'm okay.
Great.
Well, wait, can you just say a little bit about the opportunities for people to get radio licenses?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So we're waiting on the FCC to issue a rulemaking which will interpret the Local Community Radio Act, and until that happens, we don't have an exact timeline for folks to apply, but you can get on our list and we'll update you as updates come out. And in terms of best practices, for now, one thing that groups who are interested in starting stations can do, obviously PEG stations already have the types of community engagement and involvement that we've discussed, but if you're not a PEG station, one thing that you can do is to start kind of evaluating the media landscape in your community, look at what voices are left out of the media, what issues aren't being covered. And it's too soon to tell where any particular radio station is going to be available, but it's not too soon to start, making alliances with other organizations in your community and figuring out what would be best, what's needed locally. And that process can result, if you don't have a low power license, it can result in another media project that's appropriate for your community. So it's a good process to engage in at this stage. You may end up building a mesh network or some other network to serve your community.
Josh, anything?
I just want to plug at the National Conference for Media Reform in Boston, we'll be organizing a panel on emerging technologies for community-controlled infrastructure. So some exciting opportunities that'll help you understand that, yes, you can do this at home.
Great. Thanks. So in closing, I must thank everyone who contributed to the report. There were many people interviewed. Also must mention Greg Eplerwood, under whose leadership of the ACM this report began. Thank all of you for attending. The report is on our website, and if you're interested in the maps of the 2,000 PEG stations that Rob McCausland has counted so far, he is sitting in the third row there. The website is oti.newamerica.net, and please join me in thanking the speakers for the rich and thought-provoking discussion, and then join us for wine and cheese at the back.